This is Beyond the Green Screen, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meteorologist Royal Norman. It's Beyond the Green Screen, the First Alert podcast. And today we're going to talk about one of my absolute favorite things. You'd probably say clouds. Yeah, clouds are up there, but saguaros, they're probably above that. And it may be because I don't know as much about saguaros as clouds. I don't know. And I've been waiting to talk to this fella for a long time. He's very busy. Don Swann, he's a biologist down at Saguaro National Park. And if you know anything about saguaros, you know that Saguaro National Park is the place to be to study saguaros. How you doing, Don?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I tell you what, we've had a couple of conversations on the phone, and it's just, it's really interesting. First of all, how we both came to saguaros. I'll tell my story quickly because no one cares about my story. But I was 24 years old before I ever saw a saguaro because I grew up in the Chicago area and the Midwest. And I just remember seeing these sentinels of the desert and going, what? They're real? Now, you grew up back east, too, didn't you? You didn't grow up here in Arizona.
No, I grew up in New England, and I remember I came out here on a road trip with a friend, back in the 1990s. And I drove into southern Arizona at around sunset, and it was like being in a Western movie, just the first saguaro I ever saw was just at sunset. And I fell in love with them, really, honestly, and I never get tired of spending time with them. They're just such incredible plants.
Not at all. And I'll add to my story because we flew in at night. So we flew into Tucson at night, and we drove up. My wife's dad lived in the foothills area, and so I didn't see a thing. And that morning I got up and was sitting around having a cup of coffee, and there were all these saguaros, and I was like, okay, this is another world. This is a pretty cool world, that's for sure. Yeah. So then, Don, how did you switch gears to become really an expert on saguaros and working at Saguaro National Park?
Well, I worked at Saguaro National Park before I became an expert on saguaros. I started out here as a seasonal ranger and loved it, and decided I loved the park so much I wanted to keep working here. So that was many years ago, 30 years ago. And because we are Saguaro National Park, people just asked questions. And I went to University of Arizona for graduate school. As I continued to work at the park, I just really became more and more fascinated by this plant that I was surrounded by every day. The rest is history. I just learned a little bit more each year. And every day I learned something new.
Yeah, and every day, even though I kind of hike a same area every day, I'm one of those people. Okay, it's got to be the same area. I still notice different things about different saguaros that I hadn't noticed before. They're a plant that, to me, really sort of defies definition. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it definitely does, and I think for so many of us, they look like people, right? And so. And of course they are, they're so incredibly important to the Tanawatam, the indigenous people of this area, and have been for thousands of years. And they still harvest the fruit in the park for their ceremonies. And, for them, it is that saguaros are our people. And I think all of us kind of have a relationship with this plant that goes far beyond, the way we would normally bond with a plant.
Yeah, that's a whole festival to bring the rains back to Arizona in the summer. It's just wonderful. Tell us a little bit about saguaros, and I'll just throw some things I've heard out there, and you tell me true or false. The oldest saguaro is what, 200 years old?
Yeah, I always say, ask me in 100 years.
Okay.
So we've only been studying them, as scientists for 120 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
But they probably do live. Some of them live up to 200 years or more for sure. They're really slow growing, and most people don't realize that, saguaros are, they don't reach an inch tall until they're like 6 to 9 years old.
Wow.
It can take in the drier parts of the range. It can take 30 years to get to be a foot tall, and they don't start to reproduce until they're 50 to 75 years old. So this is a slow plant. It kind of comes into the world slowly, and then once it does start to reproduce, it can reproduce until it dies. And that could be a couple hundred years.
And when these plants are small, obviously they're vulnerable to almost everything, aren't they?
they're particularly vulnerable to just the dryness in the desert.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like all plants need water to live on, and saguaros, when they're big, they can store a lot of water, right? They're columns of water that go up into the sky. But when they're tiny and they grow so slowly, they really need the water from the soil, and so that's what makes them so vulnerable. But of course, yeah, they get eaten by ants. They're eaten by rodents. There's lots that will eat them, but really, the water is kind of the thing that really is the biggest challenge for them.
Yeah, and you were telling me it also helps if they have, for lack of a better word, a nurse plant that gives them a little shade when they're very young and vulnerable. That helps too.
Yeah, on a lot of levels. So, obviously it protects them from the heat during the summer, and the moisture under the trees is going to be greater than it is just out in the open. And then we get cold nights here in the desert too. So the trees actually protect them in the winter from the cold, from frost.
Oh, okay. So here's another myth I'm going to throw at you. A saguaro's got to be 80 years old before a branch can form.
Yeah, that's about right.
Oh,
It takes quite a while for them to be tall enough to form the branches. So yeah. They kind of just they grow very slowly when they're young. They start to shoot up in their adolescence, like 30 to 60 years old, and then they do start to branch, and then they start to put the growth into the branches. So yeah, that's about right. It very the thing is everything with a saguaro is going to be an average, and it's going to be based on the environment that it lives in. So in the western deserts in Arizona, if you go out by Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument,
hmm.
the saguaros there are going to grow more slowly than they do on the east side of Tucson because they don't get as much rain there.
Ah, so that's a serious consideration is the rain. Is it heat? Now, we are getting hotter and hotter and hotter in the deserts of Arizona. Is heat or climate change, is that going to impact saguaros at some point, or do we even know if it will?
Yeah, I think the short answer is we don't know. There's a lot of ways it could impact saguaros. I don't know very much about the causes of the saguaros in Phoenix dying. I've been reading that on the media and talked to some of the scientists, but there are some people that believe that it's just because of the extremely high, temperatures that you're getting in Phoenix, and a lot of that is the urban heat effect, just all
Hmm.
the asphalt. Um, but I think one of the concerns that we have at the park here is we are seeing these higher temperatures um, during those times of the year when the soil is already kind of drying out, and so the higher temperatures dry the soil out faster. So the way that we are seeing the big change that we've seen in the last 25, 30 years is not as many of the seedlings surviving. And we, of course, we don't know exactly why that's happening, but we do attribute it to drought. It's definitely highly connected and correlated with drought, and that drought is exacerbated by these higher temperatures that we're getting.
Now, remind me to get back to that. But I do want to talk about the falls, the Saguaro Falls that we had really beginning in 2020. That was a very hot summer. And then it seemed like last summer, which was another record breaking summer, we had tons of falls, Saguaro Falls around the
Yeah.
valley, as you say. And no one really knows for sure why that happens. Um, uh, there's not even a really good guess. I mean, it could be the heat, it could be the dryness, but it could just be that a bunch of saguaros just got old at the same time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of those urban saguaros, they may have been transplants. Their roots
Mm.
may not have had the opportunity to grow out and take in as much water as some of the ones in the wild. So yeah, it's really hard to know. It's something that really needs to be studied and better understood.
So is a transplanted saguaro less likely to live a longer life because of the shock of being transplanted? Because every day on Craigslist you can see someone selling a saguaro in their yard with a couple of arms, and if you
Yeah.
can drag it into your yard and plant it, you can have it. Does that limit their lifetime? Do we know?
Yeah, great question. I mean, definitely they can be transplanted and do very well. There was a study in Tucson a few years ago that it really kind of showed that the younger you transplant it, the more likely it is to survive.
Uh,
So that makes sense, right? If
yeah.
you're transplanting one that's 4 or 5 feet tall, that's going to do a lot better than one that's maybe 30 feet tall that has arms on it. And so the study really kind of indicated that that seems to be the case, that the larger ones just don't transplant as well. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. including that it's just, just like older people, it's sort of harder to kind of grow and adapt to the new situation when you're a lot older. So it takes time for those roots to grow out, and a younger plant is going to be just more able to produce new roots that can go out a long way.
I think Don said I'm less adaptable than I was 10, 15 years ago. I'm just kidding.
I'm speaking for myself.
Hey, so let's talk about the smaller saguaros because I have read a bunch of studies about that, and I think a lot of them came from down there at the park, at the national park in Tucson, the Saguaro National Park. And by the way, this is Don Swann, who's a biologist down there. Um, are we seeing less and less juvenile saguaros, and is that something to be concerned about?
Yeah. Well, so the short answer is yes. But I want to put it in context.
Okay.
So we had a really great kind of boom period for saguaros in the park, starting in the '60s and really going on through the '70s, and then really in the '80s. So we had a series of kind of cooler, wetter years in the late '80s into the early '90s, and during that period of time, we had a lot of young saguaros entering the population, and those populations are growing and slowly reaching reproductive age. What has happened, however, is since the early '90s, mid '90s, we are not seeing as many of the young ones surviving.
Hmm.
So because it takes a long time for them to reach reproductive age, because they live for a long time, I always say, like, we're concerned about the lack of young saguaros, but we're not alarmed yet. But it's something we're keeping an eye on. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, just in terms of context, is that we never ever get a crop of saguaros every year, right? So the natural wet and dry cycles in the desert are such that you'll have a series of dry years and then a series of wet years, and so saguaros have adapted to kind of doing well during those series of wet years. So we've been in a period now where we have not had a series of wet years enough to kind of sustain a lot of young saguaros through the early critical years of their life. We haven't had that for 25 years or so, at least in the Tucson area. So
So,
it's something we're keeping a close eye on.
yeah, so concerning but not alarming. I think that's what you said. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. I
that's
mean,
cool.
if it goes on for another 20 years, we'll become alarmed.
Oh my goodness,
Yeah,
no.
yeah,
Because here's the thing. Again, I'm going to exaggerate because that's what I do. I'm a weatherman. I exaggerate. Is I read that a saguaro in the course of its lifetime, if it grows to be over 100 years or 150 years old, will literally put out millions and millions and millions and millions of seeds. But the chance that one of those seeds will actually grow into another saguaro that will actually have more seeds is like almost zero. Is that true?
you're totally right. I mean, yeah. See, individual fruit can produce. I mean, I've heard as many as 2,000
Hmm.
seeds. And so if you think about, I mean, just go out on look at a large saguaro during the fruiting season. I mean, they'll be covered with literally hundreds of fruit in some cases, and yeah, and and then that saguaro's doing it again the next year. So yeah, no, they produce so many seeds. And yes, I mean, most years none of many years none of those seeds survive,
Hmm.
and most years only a few survive. And then, as I said, once in a while we get a really great year, and a lot of them survive.
That's very,
So
yeah.
that's just kind of how they've adapted to living in the desert, and it's been an effective strategy for them.
Yeah, well, I get it. Yeah, millions and
Yeah,
millions of seeds, and a few of them work, and we're okay. We're good to go,
yeah,
right? Those
yeah,
saguaros.
yeah.
So when saguaros are at that, let's say 2 or 3 foot stage, and well, how what could they be 20 years old by then if they're 2 or 3 feet?
They could be
Yeah.
in the wetter parts of their range, but they could also be quite a bit older, like, yeah, in the drier parts of the
Oh, I
range.
got you. Okay.
Yeah,
So it really is, it's dependent on how much moisture they're getting. Does it
yeah,
also depend on, like, sometimes when I've been lucky enough to fly around Arizona, I'll see saguaros on one side of a ridge and then you cross over and then there's no saguaros on the other side of the ridge. Does sunlight have something to do with it?
yeah. Isn't that incredible,
Yeah.
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they definitely do better on south-facing slopes.
Oh.
They like the sun, and yeah, if you look at a single mountain that goes up, to I don't know 4,000 feet or so, you'll see that the saguaros go quite a bit higher on the south side than they do on the north side. And part of that is certainly here is that the northern sides of the mountains often during the winter they don't get sunlight at all during the day,
Oh,
and so if you get a series of really cold nights, the days may not even warm up enough, and that will affect the survival. But certainly they grow faster on the south sides of the mountains. In fact, something that people don't know about saguaros is they actually grow faster on the south side of the saguaro. So you'll get kind of a thicker layer of cortex there outside of the ribs on the
really?
south facing side. So they're sun lovers,
Oh,
no question about it. Yeah.
now we see a lot of, in fact, almost every saguaro I see has a lean to it, one way or the other. So that's kind of common. But how do they, like, some of them have really big leans and they stay up for years? Is that just because they're built so sturdy?
Yeah, well, so they have a network of roots that goes out a really long way.
Mm,
And a swallow that's just even a few feet tall will have roots that can go out maybe, 30, 40 feet more.
wow.
So that, if you think about it, that network of roots is sort of allowing it to, it's sinking into the ground and it's giving it stability. So the very tall saguaros are going to have a really dense network of roots that will allow them to stand up, even if they're leaning quite a bit. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what keeps them up. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, flowers. One of the best parts of saguaros, flowering season. Now up here, where I'm doing a lot of my hiking, we had a very late and short flowering season.
Yeah.
And I know I've asked you once or twice on the phone. Do saguaros know what the weather's going to be like the coming summer? Should
They,
we be watching them a little
we,
closer?
we joke about this because it seems like they do. Yeah. So I mean, if you look kind of at some of the longer term studies of their flowering, they definitely they seem to they will flower later. Well, when we have a cool, wet winter,
Hmm.
and they'll ironically produce fewer flowers. And so the fact that the flowers were later and fewer this season was consistent with the fact that we had most of southern Arizona. We had a pretty cool, wet winter, and so yeah, and then when we have a kind of a hotter, drier summer. Actually, I'm going to ask you this question
All right.
myself because I've been wondering, because I don't know if I'm making this up or not. But when we have a hotter, drier winter, the saguaros seem to produce more flowers and flower a little bit earlier. And is that because if we have those conditions, will we tend to have an earlier, stronger monsoon? And if
Well,
so, maybe the saguaros know that.
maybe you just solved our big question every year is when the monsoon's going to get here, right? I mean, that's
Yeah, you
pretty.
could use the saguaro index.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, and and then I've only seen it once in the area where I live. I've lived there, I don't know, 25 years or so, where the saguaros flowered twice, once in the spring and once in the fall. What's going on with that?
I wish I could answer that question, but I can't. But I've noticed it too, and I get calls about it. So about 4 years ago, we started studying that. Whether it happened often in the past, I don't know, but most people that have been around a long time say they just didn't see it in the past. What we're seeing in our studies is that some years we get fall flowers in some places, and whereas in other places in the same year we might not get fall flowers. So there is some kind of climate relationship because it's both kind of related to their habitat and the timing. So some years we don't get any, some years we get a lot, and then some years we get some in some places but not in other places. But the swallows that do flower in the fall also tend to have flowered in the summer, so they are actually putting out a second crop of flowers.
Yeah, that
The
is.
crazy thing is, we had a few years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, we had saguaros flowering in December and producing fruit in January, and the fruit had viable seeds. The seeds we planted them and they germinated. So it's really strange. We're trying to kind of understand what are the environmental triggers that might be causing fall flowering, but I can't say that I know at this point.
Well,
So
one of the things you seem to be telling me is that even if there is climate change, there is climate change going on, but to whatever degree it's going on,
yeah,
saguaros may figure it out, and maybe we don't have to worry about them too much, right? They're not going anywhere.
yeah. I don't know. I mean,
Oh, okay, there we
I
go.
don't.
Maybe I
Yeah.
should be more worried.
Yeah.
I mean, they seem like they're pretty sturdy plants, but I mean, they could be impacted by anything from heat to lack of rain. They're like any other plant in the
Yeah.
universe, I suppose, huh?
Yeah, we had a crazy thing happen last summer, August 22nd. We had a microburst, a really
Oh,
small, short, but very powerful storm. And you probably know more about these than I do. And it knocked over. We went out and mapped the saguaros that were knocked over during that storm, and just in the park itself. And it went onto private land outside the park, but just in the park itself, 1,200 saguaros came down
wow,
in that storm.
wow.
But again, no one's ever really looked at this before. We don't know if these kinds of events are increasing or so we're just trying to go out there and kind of document and see, what are these different sources of mortality for this plant and is it changing?
Here's my wild card question for you because I didn't even prep you on this, so I apologize. Is there any idea how many saguaros there are in Saguaro National Park?
We have an answer to that.
Ah,
It's an estimate. I'm not gonna go too overboard on it, but we estimate there are about 2 million saguaros in Saguaro National Park,
so
and that's
cool.
based on just kind of taking our saguaro. So we have a program called the Saguaro Census, and every 10 years we go out and we count a lot of saguaros and measure them and map them on randomly located plots, and from those plots we can come up with a pretty good guesstimate of how many saguaros there are in the park.
That's pretty cool. All right, so do you have like I don't know, a favorite saguaro or a favorite saguaro store? I mean, I had a favorite saguaro and it was old and I knew it would come down. It did come down, and now I have another favorite saguaro. Do you have a favorite saguaro that you like, or saguaros, or an area of saguaros that you really think are cool?
I don't have a favorite Saguaro. And I get the question all the time,
Yeah.
but I don't like to pick favorites. It's like
You
kids. You
got
want
2 million of them.
but I do. I mean, one really great place to see saguaros in the park is from the visitor center in the West District in the Tucson Mountain District, which is the closest to I-10 if you're coming down from Phoenix, and the
Right.
and the view out the back is just it's spectacular. I mean, it's really truly an incredible vista of saguaros, and that whole area just has a really high number of saguaros, and I think a lot of particularly beautiful ones.
And when you find people that come to the park, are they, I mean, are they as curious? They've got to be as curious as everybody else about saguaros because they're such a cool plant. They must ask you a million questions.
Well, they do, and the crazy thing is, people actually know about saguaros all over the world.
Mm,
Because I'm into saguaros, people send me pictures of saguaro motifs, from Europe and Russia
yeah,
and all kinds of places. So people are very aware of this plant. I think probably from Western movies,
that is,
and so yeah, they're very curious. They have so many questions, and I always like to, as a scientist, I'm interested in answering those questions with the best data that we have, and sometimes that we can't answer a question and we can look it up, and sometimes we still can't answer the question, and I feel like if it's an interesting question that we can't answer, that's probably a question that we should try to learn something about. And so that, like, for example, the fall flower study was really based on people just asking us what's going on, and no one had really studied that before. So yeah, no, people have questions all the time, every day, all year long, day after day, and a lot of them are great questions.
that's fantastic. I do want to mention one of the scourges of the park, buffalo grass. Tell us the deal on that and why you don't want any buffalo grass in your park.
So bufflegrass was brought here originally from Africa, and when plants are brought from other countries to a new country, they usually come in the form of seeds, and they don't bring their predators with them. They don't bring their diseases with them. They don't bring all the things that regulate their population with them. And so bufflegrass was one of these examples. It was brought here. Really, my understanding is for conservation purposes. During the Dust Bowl, we were really worried about soil erosion, and
Hmm.
so a lot of these plants were brought in to stabilize the soils. Um, but it spread into the desert, and really began to grow in kind of an unchecked way once its population got high enough. The two things that really scare us a lot about buffalo grass is first that it can compete with not just saguaros, but particularly with baby saguaros, but other desert plants for water.
Hmm.
So it's very effective at taking up water right after the rain, and then it will shade them out, and it forms this kind of monoculture. So it competes with the desert plants, and it'll kind of wipe them out in an area over a period of time as it becomes denser. And then the other thing is that it is adapted to fire. So saguaros are not adapted to fire. They have very thin skin, and if they burn, that will kill them. And a lot of other desert plants are the same way, because in the desert, typically there's just dirt in between the
Yeah.
plants. There's not enough fuel to really kind of carry that fire. That buffalo grass comes in and it fills in those spaces. It fills in that dirt and it will carry fire. And then after the fire, it'll come back stronger than ever. Whereas, the saguaros will die, and it'll be a long, long time before they can grow back, if ever.
It sounds like the salt cedar that grows in some of our waterways, where it burns off, but the roots are still there, and so it comes
Yeah,
back even stronger after
yeah,
it burns. It's kind of the same deal with buffalo grass, huh?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so.
Wow,
Yeah.
that is amazing. So how do you get rid of it? I mean, I guess I've seen video and stuff of people picking it. Is that the only way to get rid of it?
We do we use herbicide treatments, where our young, very young, strong interns are out with backpack sprayers, spraying individual plants, because we don't want to hurt the natives.
Right.
Um, but yeah, no, a lot of it is pulling it. I mean, most of the year, we are out there. We've got young interns, but we also have a lot of volunteers. So literally hundreds of people come out to the park every year to pull buffalo grass, and if you're kind of strategic about it, and you go, you pull it, and then you come back when the seedlings grow up again, you can get rid of it. We've had there's plenty of places in the park where there's still buffalo grass, but we've done a really great job of kind of clearing the buffalo grass out of the areas that visitors usually go to. And it's just a question of then of just kind of maintaining it, and so it can be done. We've done really well with our volunteer efforts. They're not going to end anytime soon. We're going to be fighting buffalo grass for a while to come, but you can really see the difference in a lot of places, and most places in the park. To be honest, you're going to go there. You're going to see saguaros and beautiful desert plants, and you're not going to see buffalo
Oh,
grass.
that's fantastic. So you mentioned volunteers. Folks can volunteer down there all the time. How do they just check in on the website and figure out a way to volunteer and make their time available to you, and it's that easy?
It's pretty easy. We do have a volunteer page on our website. As I said, most of the volunteers we have are in the winter, and we either have events. So if you have a group, you could come down and pull buffalo grass for a day. We have public events usually every Saturday and sometimes on weekdays, where people can just join with other people in the public. And then we have a lot of just individual volunteers who come out on their own. They learn how to identify it and pull it, and they just come out when they want some exercise and they want to do some good for the saguaro. So we have a lot of different kinds of volunteers, and quite a large number of volunteers.
I love that. That's fantastic. Don, I've had a great time talking to you. Don Swann, who's a biologist at the Saguaro National Park in Tucson. We're going to do this again because I probably got, another hour worth of questions about saguaros, which is my absolute favorite plant in the world. And
Well,
thank you.
anybody that knows me knows that I can just talk for hours about saguaros. I just love this plant, and I really appreciate your enthusiasm. And I know a lot of your listeners are big saguaro enthusiasts too. So good for you. It's a wonderful plant, and we're so lucky to be its neighbor.
I agree. We'll do it again soon, okay?
Okay, great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Don.
This is Beyond the Green Screen, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.